Chapter 1. The Midnight Watch.
The clock on the wall was the loudest thing in the room. Tick, tick, tick. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. At this hour, the world outside was asleep, but in the waiting room of St. Jude's Hospital, 4 people were wide awake. They were strangers, sitting on cold plastic chairs, separated by empty seats and heavy silence. In the corner sat Arthur, an elderly man with silver hair and tired eyes. He held a weathered violin case on his lap as if it were a precious child. He didn't look at anyone. He only watched the red light above the heavy double doors of the operating room. 3 seats away was Elena. She was a shocking sight for a hospital. She wore a beautiful white wedding dress, but the bottom of the skirt was stained with gray dust. Her makeup was ruined by old tears, and she stared at her bare feet. She didn't have her shoes. Then there was Marcus. He was a tall man in an expensive Italian suit. He looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not a waiting room. He was constantly checking his golden watch and tapping his foot nervously on the floor. Tap, tap, tap. He looked angry, but if you looked closer, his hands were shaking. Finally, near the door, sat Nurse Sarah. She wasn't on duty. She sat quietly, wearing a simple blue coat over her uniform. In her hands, she gripped a thick, yellow envelope. She looked at the other 3 people with a strange, knowing expression, but she said nothing.
The silence was heavy.
It was the kind of silence that happens when people are afraid to ask a question because they are afraid of the answer. Why were they all there? Who was behind those double doors? Suddenly, the vending machine made a loud whirring sound. Marcus jumped. He looked at the others, his face pale. "Does anyone know how much longer?" he asked, his voice cracking. No one answered. The mystery of the night was just beginning.
Chapter 2. The Sound of Silence.
The silence in the waiting room was like a heavy blanket. Marcus couldn't stand it anymore. He stood up and began to pace. Click, click, click. His leather shoes hit the floor with a sharp sound. He looked at his phone, but the screen was black. "Battery is dead," he muttered to himself, his voice echoing. "Of all the nights for my phone to die, it has to be tonight." He looked at the others, hoping for a reaction, but Elena didn't move. She was like a statue in her white dress. Arthur only tightened his grip on his violin case. Marcus stopped in front of the vending machine. He wasn't hungry, but he needed to do something. Anything. He put a coin in, and the machine made a loud clunk. A bag of chips fell. The sound felt like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Sorry," Marcus said, looking at Nurse Sarah. Sarah looked up from her yellow envelope. "It's okay," she said softly. "The silence is harder to bear than the noise, isn't it?" Marcus sat back down, 2 seats away from Arthur. "I was supposed to be in Singapore tonight," Marcus said, though no one had asked. "A big merger.
Millions of dollars.
And then I got the call. I didn't even have time to change my clothes." Arthur finally turned his head. His eyes were kind but very sad. "Money is a fast runner, young man," the old man said slowly. "But it cannot run faster than a phone call from a hospital."
Elena suddenly made a small sound, a sob.
She was trembling. The white fabric of her wedding dress shook. "I was at the altar," she whispered. The music was playing. Everyone was smiling. And then, the doors opened, but it wasn't the groom. It was a man in a suit, telling me there was an accident. The mystery deepened. Who was the person in the surgery room? Was it Marcus's business partner?
Elena S. Grom.
Or someone else entirely? Nurse Sarah looked at the yellow envelope in her lap. She seemed to want to speak, but she stopped. She looked at the red light above the surgery door. It stayed on, bright and cold. They were all waiting for the same light to die, so they could finally breathe again.
Chapter 3. Dei violini stesse secret.
Arthur looked at the violin case on his lap. His fingers traced the scarred wood of the box. "My son bought me this violin 40 years ago," he said suddenly. The room went still. Even Marcus stopped tapping his foot. "He was only 10 years old," Arthur continued, a small smile appearing on his tired face. "He saved his pocket money for 3 years. He wanted me to play in the great concert halls of Europe." Elena wiped a tear from her cheek. "Did you?" she asked softly. Arthur shook his head. "No."
Life happened.
"I worked in a factory to pay for his medical school. The violin stayed in this case for a long time.
It gathered dust, just like my dreams."
He looked at the red light of the operating room. "But my son."
He never forgot.
Every time he saw me, he asked, "Father, when will you play for me again? Is he the one in there?" Marcus asked, pointing toward the heavy doors. His voice was no longer sharp. It was quiet and respectful. Arthur nodded slowly. "He is a surgeon here. He saves lives every day. But tonight, he wasn't the doctor. He was the victim." A car hit him right outside the hospital gates. The silence returned, but it felt different now. It wasn't cold anymore. It was full of shared pain. Arthur opened the case. The violin glowed under the flickering hospital lights. He didn't play it, but he held the bow. "I promised him," Arthur whispered. "I told him that if he survived this night, I would play his favorite song right here in this hallway." Nurse Sarah looked at Arthur, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She looked down at the yellow envelope in her hands and gripped it tighter. The information gap was growing. What was in that envelope, and how did it relate to the surgeon?
Chapter 4. The Torn Veil.
The room felt colder as Elena began to speak. Her voice was thin, like a thread that was about to break. "I was standing at the altar for 20 minutes, she said. The church was full of white lilies. The scent was so strong, it was almost suffocating. My father was holding my hand, whispering that everything would be okay." She looked at her bare, cold feet. But Julian didn't come. People started to whisper. "I thought he changed his mind. I thought he didn't love me anymore. I felt so humiliated, so small." Marcus stopped looking at his watch. He sat down across from her. "What happened?" he asked softly.
"A man in a dark suit walked into the church," Elena whispered.
"He wasn't a guest. He was a police officer. He told me there was a multi-car accident on the highway.
A van had lost control.
Julian's car was right behind it." She gripped the silk of her dress until her knuckles turned white. "He was rushed here. I didn't even take off my dress. I just ran. I lost my shoes in the parking lot, but I didn't care. Arthur looked at Elena with deep empathy. Love doesn't care about shoes, my dear, he said. It only cares about the heart. The mystery began to pull the strangers together. Marcus looked at Arthur, then at Elena. Wait, Marcus said, his brow furrowing. Arthur, you said your son was hit by a car outside the gates. Elena, you said Julian was in a crash on the highway.
My business partner.
He was also in a car tonight. He was coming to pick me up for the airport.
A sudden realization hit the room.
3 different stories, 3 different locations, but all leading to this one hallway. Nurse Sarah, who had been silent, suddenly stood up. The yellow envelope in her hand trembled. The accident on the highway caused a chain reaction, she said. It wasn't just one car. It was 4. And the surgeon who tried to help at the scene was Arthur's son. Everyone turned to Sarah. How did she know so much? She wasn't just a nurse waiting for a shift. She was holding something that could change everything.
Ding!
The elevator doors opened at the end of the hall, but no one came out. The red surgery light flickered, then stayed on. The wait continued.
Chapter 5. The letter.
Nurse Sarah looked at the 3 strangers. Her face was calm, but her eyes held a deep secret. I wasn't supposed to be here tonight, she whispered. I finished my shift at 8 p.m. But as I was leaving, a paramedic handed me this. It was found in the pocket of the man who caused the accident. Marcus frowned. The man who caused it. You mean the driver of the van? Sarah nodded. He didn't survive the crash. But he was holding this letter. He was trying to reach the hospital before he died. Not as a patient, but as a messenger. Elena reached out a trembling hand and touched the paper. Why give it to us? Because, Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly, this letter isn't just a letter. It's a confession. And it mentions a name. A name that connects all of you. Arthur stood up, leaning on his violin case for support. Read it, Sarah.
The silence in this room is evident.
We need the truth. Sarah opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper and an old, faded photograph. She cleared her throat and began to read. To whoever finds this, I have spent 20 years running from a mistake. 20 years ago, I worked at the Citibank. I made a choice that ruined lives. I stole money to save my own son, but in doing so, I destroyed the dreams of a young violinist, a businessman's father, and a little girl's future. Marcus gasped. His face went red, then pale. My father. His company went bankrupt 20 years ago because of a bank scandal. He never recovered. He died thinking he was a failure. Arthur's hands began to shake.
The factory.
I lost my job at the factory because the bank closed our accounts. That was the year I stopped playing the violin. Elena looked at the old photograph. It was a picture of a small playground. I know this place, she whispered. This was the park near my childhood home. My parents lost that house. We moved away. And that's how I met Julian. The information gap was closing, but a new mystery appeared. Why was this man coming to the hospital tonight? Suddenly, the red light above the operating room door began to flicker. BZZZT. BZZZT.
Chapter 6. The unexpected connection.
There is more, Sarah said. her voice barely a whisper. She turned the letter over. The handwriting at the bottom was fresh, written in a hurry, perhaps just hours before the crash. I am coming to the hospital tonight because I found out who the head surgeon is. He is the son of the man I hurt the most, the violinist. I wanted to give him the evidence to clear his father's name and return the money to the families I ruined. I wanted to ask for forgiveness before my heart failed me. Arthur slumped back into his plastic chair. Tears carved deep lines into his weathered face. My son. He was going to meet this man? That's why he was outside the gates. Wait, Marcus said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and realization. If this man was the driver of the van on the highway, and Julian was behind him, and your son was waiting for him, the puzzle was complete. The accident wasn't just a random event. It was a collision of past and present. The man who stole their past was trying to give them back their future, but fate had other plans. Elena looked at the red light. The man who caused the accident. He is dead. But Julian and Arthur's son. They are still in there. They are fighting for their lives because of a man who was trying to say, I'm sorry.
Suddenly, the beep, beep, sound from behind the doors changed.
It became a long, flat tone. Beep. The red light stopped flickering. It didn't turn green. It simply went out. The silence that followed was the most terrifying thing any of them had ever heard.
Marcus grabbed the edge of the vending machine.
Elena fell to her knees, her white dress spreading out like a broken lily on the floor. Arthur closed his eyes and hugged his violin case to his chest. Nurse Sarah dropped the letter. The paper drifted through the air, landing silently on the cold tiles. The doors of the operating room began to swing open.
Chapter 7. The light above the door.
The world seemed to stop spinning. The long beep of the monitor still rang in their ears, but the surgeon's expression was hard to read. He looked at the four strangers, the old man, the bride, the businessman, and the nurse. Who is the family of Arthur's son? The surgeon asked, his voice hoarse. Arthur stood up, his legs shaking. I am his father. The surgeon took a deep breath. The flat line you heard. That was the other man. The driver of the van. We could not save him. His heart was too weak from years of stress and regret. He paused, looking at Elena. And Julian. She whispered, her voice barely audible. Julian is stable, the surgeon said, a small smile finally appearing. He had a very difficult surgery, but he is a fighter. And Arthur. He turned to the old man. Your son is also stable. He was the one who performed the first emergency procedure on Julian at the scene of the accident before he collapsed himself. They are in the recovery room together. A collective gasp of relief filled the hallway. Elena sank into the chair, sobbing, this time with joy. Marcus put his head against the cold wall, his shoulders shaking. He wasn't thinking about Singapore or mergers anymore. He was thinking about his father, and how this letter could finally clear his name. Arthur didn't say a word. He walked slowly toward the operating room doors. He stopped, picked up the bow of his violin, and tightened it. Creak. The first note of the violin was soft and low. It was a sad note. But it was beautiful. It echoed through the sterile, quiet halls of the hospital. Arthur began to play the song his son had waited 40 years to hear. It was a song of forgiveness, of lost time, and of a new morning. Nurse Sarah watched them, holding the yellow envelope.
The truth was out.
The money would be returned. The names would be cleared. The information gap was gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace.
Chapter 8. Sunrise at the exit.
The music had stopped, but the melody seemed to hang in the air like a sweet perfume. It was 6 a.m. Arthur packed his violin away with gentle hands. He looked younger than he had 3 hours ago. He opened his eyes, Arthur said, smiling at the others. My son squeezed my hand. He told me the music was the best medicine he ever had. Marcus held the yellow envelope firmly. I'm going to find a lawyer, he said. There was no anger in his voice, only a quiet determination. Not to sue anyone, but to fix the records. My father's name will be honorable again. And the rest of this money. It belongs to the families who lost everything. I'll make sure they get it. Elena had found a pair of simple hospital slippers to wear. She looked at her wedding dress and laughed softly. It's ruined, she said, touching the gray stains. But I think I like it better this way. It's a dress that survived a battle. She looked at her phone. Julian was awake and waiting for her in the recovery ward.
Nurse Sarah stood by the glass doors.
We were all strangers when the sun went down, she said, looking at the group. But the shadows of the night brought us together. They stood at the exit for a moment, hesitant to leave. In one night, they had shared secrets they hadn't told their own families. They had faced death and found a reason to live more deeply. We are never truly alone, Arthur said, looking at the busy street outside. Every person you pass on the street is carrying a story. Sometimes, all they need is a quiet room and someone to listen. As they walked out into the warm morning light, they didn't look like the broken people who had arrived at midnight. They were survivors. They were witnesses to the fact that even in a cold hospital waiting room, human connection is the strongest force in the world.